go live here. Kelly, you still have your radio on, right?
Yep.
Okay.
It's live.
Welcome to another conversation with Perspectives on Policing. My name is Colette Bell. I work here at UW Parkside, and we have Officer Kurt here, Officer Kelly, and Chief Howell here to join us in today's conversation. So as we go throughout the conversation, please feel free to comment on either our Instagram page or our Facebook Live page, and we'll be able to answer those questions live. So I'm gonna just go around the table and have everyone kind of introduce themselves and their background. Do a quick one, Kurt, since most of us may know you already.
Yeah, again, Kurt Bergendahl. Been here 20 plus years, and the reason why we do this is because I was seeing a lot of the divide in our community between the police and the communities we serve, and it was quite hurtful to myself and a lot of the officers that I serve with. So we wanted to have these conversations. Joe and I had been talking about it for several years, and with all of what was happening in Kenosha and our surrounding communities, we really felt the need to bring this about. The chancellor believes in it too, and gave us the Facebook and Instagram of the campus to do this. So that's kind of where we're at, and I'll turn it over to Kelly. Kelly can introduce herself.
Hi everybody, Kelly Anderchek, police officer here for 22 years. My domain on campus is sexual assault, domestic violence, and human trafficking. So I do all the sexual assault investigations and then trauma training as well. So that's kind of my domain, along with anything that we get sent to. Those are my specialties. I am chair of the sexual assault response team for Kenosha County, and I also train around the state with the Department of Justice, training officers, state nurses, and prosecutors on neurobiological trauma response to sexual assault victims and domestic violence victims.
And then we're lucky enough that we have Chief Howell here today from Racine. So Chief, we'll ask that you kind of talk about yourself a little bit.
Sure, thanks for the invitation. First of all, Art Hall from the city of Racine, born and raised there. Graduated from the unified school system there, and been a part of the Racine Police Department for over 30 years. We practice community policing philosophy there, so if there are any questions relative to that, we can go deeper. Since I was appointed chief, we had a major focus on human trafficking in our region, not just in Racine, but in southeast Wisconsin and beyond. And so I'd be interested to answer any questions relative to that. I'm here today, obviously, if we start with the event with Trayvon Martin back in 2012, all the way through Breonna Taylor, George Floyd, Jacob Blake, go to Ferguson, Mike Brown, Eric Garner, New York. I mean, policing has changed over the years. Social media completely changes it in another context. And so we want to do everything we can do to bridge the gap between the police and community, because I found that in my 30 plus years, we couldn't do our job, right, without the support and the respect and the trust of the community. So opportunities such as this give us an opportunity to re-engage and connect where there's disconnection, and inform where there's misinformation, and just grow. And our communities will thrive when there's greater police-community relations.
Thank you.
Thanks, Chief.
Thanks. I actually want to go into a deeper conversation with you, Chief. I know you had mentioned that you do practice community policing in Racine. Can you talk a little bit more about what that looks like?
Sure. So some police departments think that that's basically riding bicycles, right? That's a very small part of it. The element that is accurate in that respect is that you want to get out of your squad car. You don't want to drive through a neighborhood in your air-conditioned car and not get out, or in the winter in your heated car. You want to make sure that you get out of your vehicle, engage with the community, and learn who they are, understand what their needs are, listen to them, respect them. So I'll give you an example. So if I'm a police officer and I go through a particular neighborhood and I see 10 kids kind of grouped together, looks kind of like a gang. But if I'm not really intimately connected with that community, right, that I won't know who those kids are. But if I If I'm embedded in the neighborhood, I'll know, oh, that's Josh and that's Michael. These guys are all, they play at St. Cat's. They're going to practice. That's what they're doing, right? That's just the difference between a trained eye and an untrained eye, right? And if I'm an officer and I'm untrained, undisciplined, uninformed, maybe a little bias mixed into that, which we all have as people, I might approach that group differently, right? And however I approach that group, that's gonna be their frame of reference of how policing looks, right? At least to them. And so I could have done 100 things right that day, but that one wrong thing is gonna define how they feel about law enforcement. And so community policing, basically, we have 6, we don't call them substations like in New York. In New York, there are substations, right? Our community policing houses are not police substations, right? What they are, it's a base of operations where a given officer is assigned. So you work in this community, they know your cell phone number, they can call you, you know who they are, you know what the challenges are in their neighborhood. And it's not just policing. We have social workers that work out of those houses. We have probation and parole, corrections people. We have homework assistance programs. We have Karan Butler, who's generous enough, former NBA player, retired, all-star, purchased computers. There are some kids in these communities that don't have access to broadband, internet. Also, we do, if there are young people in our community who qualify for free or reduced lunch, well, when summer comes, whatever economic challenges they had that allowed them to qualify for free or reduced lunch, that economic challenge didn't go away, right? So we have meal programs that we furnish lunch through our COP houses. And so it's like a hybrid between a law enforcement building and a community resource center, right? Subject to what the specific needs of a given community are. It's not cookie cutter. You go into these 6 different locations, the services and the resources look different, subject to what the community needs.
Right, right. It sounds very responsive, right?
Yes.
You're really getting to know the community, and then after that, then you're kind of supplementing that of what does the community need.
Right.
What would you say is the impact on the Racine community due to the type of policing that you're doing there?
So I'll give you a perfect example. So like in 1995, we formed the Racine Police Athletic Association, myself, Lieutenant Hurley at the time, Officer Ivy, Officer Days, Lieutenant Jerry Balducas. There's a handful of us that knew that we needed to develop better relationships. And so we formed the Racine Police Athletic Association. We started taking these young kids fishing. So this is in 1995. Every summer there'd be a fishing trip. So we do this over the course of 20 years, 22 years to be exact. Some of those kids that were teenagers, they're 12, 13, 14 when we took them fishing, are now in their 30s, right? Some of them are close to 40. And they remember how they felt when we took them fishing. Some of them had never been out of the inner city. So when you ask, like, what's the impact? Well, the impact is you redefine what policing looks like, right? So you're not like this occupying force. You're like a resource, right? And you're a trusted partner. If there's a major event that happens, we have this connectivity that we normally wouldn't have. And so it's about building trust over time. And consistent behavior over time builds trust. And so it's not a gimmick, it's not a fad, it's not to placate anyone, it's to literally engage, right? And that's how you learn what the needs of the community are.
Thank you. Anyone else have any comments on that?
Well, the thing I would ask on that, Chief, is can you explain what the cost of that is to the community? Because we've talked about this in some of our previous shows that, and I always bring that up, that we've got to get the officers out of the cars. We need more officers in the communities, but that there's a cost to that. And how do you justify that cost to the community? How do you get the lawmakers, the legislators, the mayors to understand that?
So great question. Like, so in Wisconsin, I'm sure other states have this challenge. So over the years, we've lost shared revenue. Shared revenue has depreciated, and through a lot of other resources, sometimes you're landlocked. The ability to continue to fund policing at a high level is, diminished. Right? So the cost of not doing this type of policing, well, first of all, let me back up. So if our philosophy was just strictly call driven, where I go to your call, I stay for 10 minutes, I leave. Well, basically what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna continue to come to that call for the next 20 years because we've not addressed the root cause, right? So the cost of doing community policing is it's high, because what happens is we don't just send an officer in for 5-10 minutes, right? We send an officer into a neighborhood for 3 years. That officer, that's not to say that officer will never handle calls for service from the radio, but their focus is that neighborhood. And so it's almost like you have your customized, person for your neighborhood. That comes at a cost. Now, I would argue to any elected official, the cost of not doing that is higher, because you'll have lawsuits, you'll have, excessive force, you'll have a lot of different things that happen when your officers are not engaged in the community. And so certainly, if you want to do the COP infrastructure, we have a very generous group of businesses that we're seeing, starting with S.C. Johnson and others. So we get supplemental help from our business community, but it is expensive, but it's more expensive to not have that philosophy.
Thank you for sharing that. Just to switch gears a little bit, Officer, we talked about trauma the last time that you were here, and how would you think that trauma affects both the police and the community?
So, trauma is trauma. It's trauma, and it's subjective to each person, and we talked about that last time. But, as we are learning and understanding prior trauma, whatever that may be, affects the next trauma and affects the next situation, you can't help but think, well, then doesn't trauma affect cops? Doesn't trauma affect doctors? Doesn't trauma affect EMTs and firefighters? And absolutely it does. We may, on the surface, have or think we have a better handle on our trauma, but we don't. And, people's thresholds for trauma based on, we do have personal lives and stuff that we've gone through, and it may not be solely, it's very hard to take a trauma in someone's life and say, well, that was personal, it doesn't count in work world, right? It doesn't affect me at the job, so those are two completely separate things. And as we are looking at that and recognizing it in trauma survivors, we are also beginning to recognize it as we move forward in policing. And so you are starting to see a lot more concentration on peer support and that trying to erase that stigma that cops throughout the years have had of, I got it. I can handle it, I got it, I don't need to talk about it, I don't need to get it out of my head, I don't need to debrief, I'm in control, I'm the big person in the room, like I got it. And we're realizing that not only does it affect our personal lives, it affects our work relationships, and it affects how we do our jobs, right? So you can't have that trauma conversation about victims of crimes without understanding that trauma affects us as well. So as with anything, once we start to realize something needs to change, it's slow. It's slow to change. First, you have to get people in departments to buy into the science of it, right? It's not somebody's opinion of whether or not this is an issue. It's the science of trauma and trying to explain how that happens and what that does to a human being. Cop or no cop, just that. And so to reference it when we're talking to law enforcement in the vein of, well, laws change all the time and we change with them, right? Things, if you have any amount of years in law enforcement with my different trainings, firearms training, evac training, things change, right? So how I was trained in 1998 is not how I do my firearms training now. Everything changes. As we learn more, it changes. And so the trauma aspect has to change as well. We have to make it okay. It can't be a thing in the locker room where, you're less of an officer if you have to go talk to somebody, or, and it has to be the buy-in all the way up, because your supervisor has to know wherever that is. It has to be able to understand, like, look, I had a rough day yesterday and I need to not come in today. I need that you know, if it's a vacation day, it's a mental, whatever it is. And that the supervisors need to not only have enough connection with their officers to recognize that, but then also to be respectful of that and shut down anything else in the department of like, oh, so-and-so's back in the, you know, talking to somebody again, or they can't handle it, maybe we need to sit them behind a desk, maybe, you know, and so it does involve the entire department, and so therefore the entire department has to buy into it. And we change, we change all the time. We change with statutes, we change with the way we train and the things that we do. This has to change too. This needs to follow that and change as well.
Yeah, and feel free, anyone, to kind of join in the conversation too, but I know that you mentioned that people are experiencing trauma, and that's anyone, it would affect how they do their job. And so have you seen that happen? You don't have to give a specific scenario, but when police officers are dealing with people in the community, have you seen officers take their trauma into their jobs? And if so, how does that negatively affect that situation? And what are some ways that we can improve that?
I think, we've got Chief here, and I'd like to hear his perspective on a little bit of this too from the Racine Police Department, because, you know, it's our brothers and sisters just to the north of us serving a large community, and I'd like to hear from the Chief on how they're handling it up there too.
So fascinating discussion. About an hour before I came here, so we have an in-house therapist at the Racine Police Department. This is like, I heard about this at a conference like about 2 years ago, and again, you talk about the budgeting issue. It wasn't easy to get it done, but we got it done. This is the best investment the police department ever made. Like, we'll spend $50,000 on a squad car with mobile data computers and all this stuff in it, but you know, we're reluctant to put that kind of money into our mental health, right? You said something that was profound, and that is, it doesn't matter, trauma is trauma, and it doesn't matter if you inherited, if you had a childhood experience that you take into adulthood, or if you had lost a child, or it doesn't matter where it occurred. You bring your trauma to work with you, just like you bring your gun to work with you. And so when you show up on the street, if you think that you're immune from taking out your frustrations on other people, you're mistaken. You're sadly mistaken. So what we did in Racine, the first major step was to bring an in-house therapist in. And you're right, there's a stigma associated with asking for help, right? So if we relied on police officers who, well, let me back up just a second and just level set, right? Police officers in general, they're not monolithic, but they're generally A-type people, right? So, and you think about this, when folks were running out of the World Trade Center, you know, in 2001, like the type of people who go into that environment are different. Because you can't be paid enough to do that. Right?
Very different out here.
There's not enough money.
There's not enough money to be so those type of people, is very hard for the helper to ask for help. So if we waited for the helpers to ask for help, you'd be waiting a long time, right?
Or it's too late.
Yeah, and for all the officers that were killed in the line of duty last year, including our own John Helen, there were over 200 officers that took their own lives.
Mhm.
So if anybody thinks that this trauma does not affect you, they're sadly mistaken. And it's not a one-time major event that is usually the catalyst. If you've been to 10 baby deaths, 5 fatal car accidents, all these things over time, they have an adverse effect on you. And it's trauma, whether it's vicarious or any other way you want to label it,
Mhm.
it's trauma. So, in addition to bringing in the healthcare, therapist, the clinician, we have an officer wellness room. So you may not be able to get that day off all the time, but if you were on a baby death 5 years ago and just seeing a baby triggers that event for you, then you may need to take some time off in our wellness room. We have a wellness room in the police department. It's far away from the sergeant's office.
Away from the administration.
Away from the administration. It's not near, it's about as far away from my office as you can get. So they go there, it's like a studio apartment, right? And so there's a massage chair there. You can take your gun belt off, you can take your vest off. There's a big screen TV, there's a sofa, there's snacks that we buy, all healthy stuff. And if you just go there for 20, 30 minutes or whatever, just when you go back on the road, you're just better equipped to do what you have to do, right? So this trauma thing is major, and police departments are figuring it out, and it's gonna cost a couple more dollars, but it's gonna save lives, and it's gonna make your departments better.
Yeah, and that's good to hear. I mean, Kelly and I, we talk about it all the time and how it compounds and stuff like that, much like you said. And trauma is trauma, whether you witnessed it, sometimes it's trauma that somebody's brought to you, and it's still trauma, and you still have to deal with it. So it's good to know that, you know, some of our other agencies out there are recognizing that and doing things.
And I'm guessing, as we've been field training officers for quite a long time, Kurt and I, and we have inputted that into our FTO program. We have, you know, it's not something that, I mean, a lot of these students coming out of the academy, they have this idea, and they're not necessarily thinking about that. And so having us be very open and honest and raw with the newbies, right? And saying like, look, here's something that really affected me, and this was 17 years ago, and I can still tell you, it's like, clearly this affected me. And being raw with them and letting them know that not only is it gonna happen to you, but it's okay to talk about it, and it's okay for you to not be okay about it.
It's not only okay to talk about it, if you don't talk about it, that's what's not okay.
That's a problem,
Yeah,
right?
the therapist, again, we were just talking about an hour and a half ago, and our therapist says to me, you know, we just hired 4 new people yesterday and today. And so the therapist says, you know, maybe, you know, we should have like just a monthly check-in with the new people. And then that way it destigmatizes, like, I'm not asking to go to the therapist.
Right.
Right,
That's
right.
just part of
Right.
the Sokolov FTO field training, you know, strategy is such that you should have that. So she gave us a great idea. I said, yeah, that's great. Let's, every month, they can just check in, just as kind of how are things going, anything you can't talk about with your field training officer, or you're not comfortable because you're new and you don't want anybody to think you're weak.
Right.
Or, you know, so that was just a great idea. So we're evolving, right? None of us have all the answers. We can just look for other departments to get best practices
Yeah.
to bring back. And that's
Yeah.
how law enforcement evolves, right? They figure out who's doing something better than you are, and then you do that.
There's no need to reinvent the wheel.
Not if you don't have to.
Right. Think smarter, not harder.
There it is.
But with that, it also, I think that probably helps the veteran, we'll say, not the salty topics, but the veteran officers, of which I am one.
Seasoned. They're
For the
seasoned.
senior, no, because that brings in the gray.
Right.
But the older officers that have been around for a long time, that also takes some of the stigma out of them then chastising these younger officers, because it's mandated, they have to go do this. And eventually, I think some of the more seasoned officers see the benefits of it too, and maybe it's not too late to help them.
Right, definitely.
So, something I wanted to touch on, kind of changing topics a little bit, but you had mentioned you guys just hired 4 new officers. It's something we've talked about as far as recruitment.
Right.
Getting officers that look more like our community.
Right.
And less like me. Okay, so how do we go about recruiting officers and getting qualified, quality applicants? How do we do that? How do we steal them from getting to Racine PD?
Yeah.
You know,
So-
because that's a problem we have.
That's really what we wanna know.
Yeah,
Right.
Understood.
Don't take 'em from you.
So here's what we're doing, and actually we're gonna be working with Dr. Albrecht to do this, right? So what we've learned is that you take color out of it, gender out of it, like we wanna start with good people, right?
Correct.
And then, you know, you want people to be reflective of the community they
community,
serve.
yeah.
That's basic math, right? So because there are fewer people of color who actually seek to be into this, so the numbers are already low to begin with.
Yeah.
So we were like, okay, listen, we're gonna have to cultivate our own people. So we met with folks at Parkside, met with Dr. Ford, Dr. Albrecht from Gateway, and then Mr. Swallow from Carthage. And we're gonna be building, and Unified, Dr. Gallion, we're gonna have a public safety pathway. And so what that looks like is, you know, starting in junior high, we're gonna develop or identify people who wanna go into this trade, right? And then we're gonna develop them through junior high and high school and give them internships between 18 and 21. And then when they're 21, these people have basically been just, they've been cultivated in our community, right? So we don't have to rely on someone coming from Atlanta or New Jersey or wherever. I mean, they know this community, they grew up in this community, and we identified them early enough to pour into them what they need to become law enforcement officers. So that first cohort will start in September of 2021.
Now, are you using your Policing Explorer program for that also?
Yeah, yeah.
Because I'm a veteran from Kenosha. I was one of the originals from the Kenosha Police Explorer, and I worked hand in hand and did a lot with the Racine Explorers.
Okay.
So I'm curious if you guys were using it. And it's hard because you don't always get diversity in that program.
That's
So-
understood.
So you're
fair-
trying to get that,
So watch this. So I'm glad you gave me the opportunity to expound. Like, so Investigator James Pettis, detective of color, came to me, and so I'm glad that you gave me the opportunity to give him his props, right? He says to me, now he runs our Explorer program.
Yeah.
So he says to me, he's chief, like, the problem with the Explorer program is you can't be in it until you're 15.
Yep.
Then you age out at 18, and then we lose contact with all those people because they can't apply till they're 21. So
Right.
he's the one that came to me to say, look, it'd be neat if we had an initiative that not only could we work with them, you know, while they're in the Explorer post, we do this academic training in Unified. He says when they become 18, then we can hire them to become cadets. And that's a 3-year window that they could literally work with us. And then they're at 21, they've actually almost been with us, you know, for 6-7 years, depending upon, you know, when they started. If they started at 15 and they were hired at 21, you know, and so, yeah, so James Pettis came to me, so he literally runs the Explorer program. The business community in Racine is willing to help supplement the cost of me losing him as a detective and having to hire another detective so that he can run the cohort in the school system. And so not only is he running our Explorer program, he's running the school system's pathway. And then when they come back at 18 to work with us, then they're basically just working for police commanders till they get 21 and they're hired. So I mean, on paper, it's brilliant, but we'll see if it works.
Right.
well, don't keep that to yourself. Share that with Kenosha,
Yeah,
please.
yeah.
I plead you to share that with Kenosha.
Yeah.
So,
Because they've got an excellent program there, but it could do the same thing. And then we're getting officers from our community
yeah.
right into our, I mean, they never left.
Yeah, and it doesn't happen as fast as we want,
No.
but this can't be fast. It has to
No.
be, you know, sincere. You want the right people, and they have the right heart for the job. They're called, like I told you, you have to be a different person to do
Right.
this. And we want to find those people early and get them prepared.
Yeah.
Fantastic.
I also
Please share that.
Yeah, I also noticed that you had mentioned a couple times in your conversation about collaborating with other parts of the community. So you talked about the Business Alliance, and we had talked about another portion of the Racing community before. How do you think that impacts how you do policing, right? It seems like it's working well, but I would like to.
Yeah, so
maybe explain on that.
another great segue opportunity. So yesterday I get a call from a local business, and they wanted to give us, we do a shop with a cop event every year, right? And so we partner with Unified, we find young people. You don't have to necessarily have a straight A, you know, if you're just trying and you're maybe a little challenged financially, we find these kids and we lift them up and we reward them. So every year we pick 50 kids to take on a shopping spree at Christmas time. So this local business, major community policing supporter, they called and said they were gonna give us like double the amount of money that it takes to run this event because they wanted it to be bigger and better this year. So because of the pandemic, we had already reduced the number of children we were gonna support this year. But with this new opportunity, what we're gonna do is expand the number of people and then let them shop virtually, and then we'll just have the officers deliver the gifts. And so, so the business community is almost like the fuel that helps us do a lot of things that are just not budgeted for. So, but here's the exchange, right? I don't just wait until I need something to go to the business community. I expect our officers to serve on boards. I expect them to coach Little League teams. I expect them to be engaged in the community some way or shape or form so that when it's time for us to use some of that trust equity, we've built up a nice bank account. And so, but that doesn't happen overnight, right? It takes years to do that. And it can take one single negative event and you can use all your equity, but if you don't have any equity, then your city will burn, you know? And so it's just about developing strong relationships, not just with the citizens, that's where it starts, business community has to buy in, local government has to buy in. It's like this complex relationship where everybody has to be at the table.
Definitely. I see that in not only how you're interacting with the community, but also with, you know, organizations and SC Johnson. Like, it is very integrated in what you do, and that's why, like, today we're having more conversations about ways we can be proactive
Right.
instead of how do we not have a situation happen in the moment, right? Because you're already having so many programs and building those relationships ahead of time.
Right.
And then that way we don't have to have those situations as often, and we're really saving money and we're saving lives that way.
Definitely. And that's not to say if you adopt a community policing philosophy, you will not have conflict. But it is to say that if there's a seat at the table for everybody, the conflict can be, you know, you can survive it just by having these built-in relationships.
Definitely. Just to switch gears a little bit too. Sorry, I don't know if I have a great flow today, but we talked about before, I think when Officer Kelly was here before, we talked about interrogations and how that can negatively impact people while they're in the interrogation room. So they talked about officers can lie in the interrogation room, and you can tell me if that's true or not true. And then in your opinion, is that ethical? And then how does that impact that whole experience for both police officers, especially when we're talking about trauma, or the citizens who are in the room with you?
You wanna hit it first, Kelly, or I?
Whatever, go ahead.
Well, I think the biggest thing people need to understand, there's two different things we're talking about. We're talking about interviews and we're talking about interrogations. An interview is a conversation. It's you talking with an individual, having a conversation about information. And an interview can be with a suspect, a witness, you know, a victim. That's an interview. You're just collecting information and maybe giving some information also. That's an interview. When we get into the interrogations, that's more of, you have somebody that you believe may be involved with this incident, and you need to get information from them to develop your basis for an arrest. So when you're dealing with that, it's a little bit differently, and the way you do the questioning may be different. It may be very similar to an interview. It may be very give and take, conversational. That's ideal. But then sometimes it can be one-sided, where it's more of an accusatory type of a thing in order to gather the appropriate information. Again, it's building a rapport with somebody. This is a community member of yours that you're trying to talk to, and you're trying to develop a rapport with them. Can we lie legally? Yes. Is it necessarily a smart thing to do? No. But there's ways in which we do it, and to say an out-and-out lie is different than doing things like I've done in interviews, where I have had somebody that I'm pretty sure was involved with a situation, and Kelly I know has had similar situations, where I don't have a piece of information, but I fabricated well, I guess this would be old school, old cassette or videotape, and just put a name on it, or maybe put a date and time on it, leave it in the room. They come in, they sit down. They see that. I leave them there for a little bit, and then I come in and say, hey, you know, we're reviewing video footage, this, that, and the other, from that date and time. Am I lying? No. Am I misleading them? Yes. I don't have any video footage. Okay. But if they had nothing to do with that, they should, that doesn't mean anything. But if they did, that makes them start to think about it. So I have done that. Is that ideal? No. Ideally, we have a conversation and people are truthful about what happened. That doesn't happen. That's not ideal either. It doesn't happen. But there's ways in which you do questioning that hopefully you get the desired result without having to lie. Because that ruins our credibility too. Because again, this is a community member. They're gonna go back out. Whether they serve time for a situation or not, they're gonna go back out in the community and share that with others, that the officer lied to them. Okay, that ruins my credibility with the community that I serve. So I don't wanna do that. That's like a last resort. Much like we talk about with, you know, everybody gets hung up on our firearm. That's a last resort. That's the last thing we wanna have to use. Same thing here. This is the last thing we wanna have to do, but we've gotten to a point where we're not gonna get that information if we don't. So we try it. If it works, so be it. If it doesn't, but it does ruin your credibility. We talk about, like Chief brought up equity, you build up this equity in your community, and now one bad lie to somebody, now that community, that reflects differently on you. Where everybody can say, hey, Officer Kurt's great, yeah, he busted me for this or that, but he didn't lie to me, he was real cool about it. And then I do that one time, and now my whole community looks at me differently. So it's not something we want to do, but we will if we have to.
And that's what we learned from that community policing aspect is if we have rapport with people, right, they're less apt to lie to us.
Mhm.
Because they already respect who I am and I respect who they are. And so it's more of a, look, I got a job to do and this is what I know, and so, what do you know about it? Some of the I cannot say that every police department, right, does everything, and every officer does everything the same way. In my years, there have been many different styles of interview and interrogation that have changed over the years because we learn, right? Because we change, because we realize that putting somebody under undue stress for no reason makes the human being do things and say things that are not necessarily true, based on fear, based on threats, based on not knowing when they can go home. You take away sleep, you take away water, you take away food from the human being, stuff starts happening, right? Physiological things happen, and you'll do what you need to do to get out of there. And so as we start to realize that, and as we learn from that, our tactics have become very different. Some of the stuff that you see on TV, right?
A lot of the
that
stuff you
hurts
see
us.
on TV is not right.
That hurts us a lot. I don't mean like hurts my heart, I mean it hurts us because your assumption as to what we're gonna do and how I'm gonna get that information from you is where you start out. And I don't even have an opportunity to have that conversation with you and help you to understand where I'm coming from, because you already think I'm gonna do a Sipowicz, I'm gonna do, and I'm gonna, if I don't get the information I want, you aren't going home, and I'm gonna beat you until you get, and that goes from, and I'm not saying that didn't happen, absolutely it happened, and it's not right. And so when you have grandparents, or that's how they were treated, and then they tell their kids, and then they tell their kids, and systematically through the familial system, that trauma passes from one generation to the next. And even though the third generation never actually experienced that particular trauma, they're scared to death that that's what's gonna happen when they speak to you, right? So we really have to do, and that community policing thing is just so important with that, is to have these conversations before we're sitting in an interrogation room, right? And having that rapport with the people who we serve, that goes a long way, right? And allowing somebody to be like, hey, so my grandmother told me, or my grandfather, or my uncle said this, and and being able to have those conversations, and also being able to say, and we are wrong, right? It's very important when we don't have that blue line of like every officer is right, and I don't care if they're wrong or not, they're right in my eyes, don't tell me that when something was wrong, something's wrong, right? And so admitting that, or even just sitting with that person and being like, I am so sorry that happened to your, family member or whatever, and that's horrible, right? And even just acknowledging that is a thing, and that happened to them, it goes a long way, right? And I'm, like Chief said, sometimes we have to go hands-on. Sometimes there are situations where we can do all of this and it doesn't work, and we have to put somebody into custody who doesn't want to go into custody, or that happens. But all of this conversation ahead of time makes such a big difference when you then have the person in front of you. For us on campus, when we have we speak in a lot of classes, we do a lot of of social things with the students here. So we always just kind of were like, oh, when we find out that they're a suspect of something, a suspect of a threat or whatever. It's like one of our kids did something, you know, and you're like, oh, are you kidding me?
That's some of the worst times
Those
when
the
you have to
worst-
bring a student
yes.
in that you know.
Yes.
That you've got
And you
somewhat of a
work with,
rapport and
and
relationship
yeah.
with.
That goes a long way
Yeah.
with that respect, right? And that, you know, it's just so important to, on both ends, not make the assumption that we're gonna beat it out of you whether the information is true or not. And also on our end, to understand that I didn't do anything to you, but you may are coming into this room with trauma or perceived trauma, and you're scared to death of what I could do to you. Because let's face it, we have a lot of power, right? And we have to acknowledge that we have the power in the room, and effectively work, you know, towards our end with that.
What's your perspective on
So
this?
it's a great question, right? So let me just say this. I mean, the responses that you guys gave were spot on. I'm just gonna try to amplify it just a little bit. 99.9% of the time, we're not dealing with interrogations. We're dealing with interviews. And sometimes they're not even interviews. Sometimes they're just where I get sent to a call. I'm not necessarily interviewing that person. I'm trying to assess what's going on. So some of it's just listening, right? So that's the first level. We show up, our presence, then we're listening. If it gets to the point where somebody's a suspect, then it may be an interview, right? The interrogation part, the part where there might be deception used, that percentage of times is so low, right? That's completely last resort, right? I'll give you an example, like, and this goes back to 1988. I was a traffic investigator. So I show up at a local business and somebody did a hit and run, but they didn't want to admit that they did it, right? Now this is actually before everybody had cameras everywhere, but a handful of businesses had cameras, right? This particular business did not have cameras, but that's not what I told the person who I thought did it. Because we had a plate, I went to their house, I found their car, it was damaged, I knew they did it, but I couldn't necessarily prove it, and so, I mean, yeah, so here's my choice, right? So I could have taken paint samples and sent them to the crime lab and did all this stuff, right, which takes time,
And costs a lot of money.
Costs a lot of money, right? So I was like, you know, the best thing for you to do is just say you did this because there's surveillance cameras in the parking lot. There were no surveillance cameras in the parking lot in 1988. Now there's hard, with Ring doorbells everywhere,
They're
it's hard to go
everywhere.
anywhere. But this was like a long time ago. So deceptive, yes, but not deceptive in a you know, like a character flaw kind of way, right? It's not like I'm lying to, and you said it beautifully. If that person didn't do anything, me saying that there was cameras there would not affect anything. It's not like you're deceptive to the point where it's gonna erode trust, right? But if you do it during regular conversations, or then now you have a problem. But that's like so much the exception and not the rule. But yeah, there's case law that allows us to do that. One other quick example: you and I, we do a robbery where we get caught. Somebody saw our plates. You're in interview room A, I'm in interview room B. Sometimes an officer will say, well, you better fend for yourself because
They're already talking.
So first person who gets the deal.
Gets the deal.
There's that back and forth. So it's not deception in a sinister sense. It's like sometimes it's just a ruse to figure out exactly what's going on. And so, you know, hopefully the listeners can appreciate, like, if you were the victim of that hit and run, or if your family member was the victim of that robbery, or worse, a homicide, then you want the officers to be as efficient and aggressive as they can to get to the bottom of it. So it all depends on perspective, but yeah, you don't want deceptive people for the sake of deception. You want deceptive people who want to keep the community safe, or, you know, if that tool is necessary. Keep it in the toolbox 99% of the time, so you
Right.
absolutely need it.
Just like our guns.
Same thing.
Right. Do you think, though, that there are opportunities where police officers are in their implicit bias, just naturally, because we all have bias, right? And they may think like this person did it, and I'm just gonna use those tools because that's what was.
Great question. So now we're getting to an area where some people would get uncomfortable, but I'm not uncomfortable because this is where the conversations need to go. If you have someone who, so I'm interviewing these 4 people over the course of the last 24 hours, and I told them, I said, listen, you obviously did really well through the police and fire commission interviews, you impressed our training people. Now you have to impress me from the perspective that I'd be putting a gun in your hand and setting you loose on the street, right? So you know who owns that responsibility? I do. So to your point, I can't see all of their biases in this interview, right? So we have to do things over time to help people understand that you have this enormous power, right? You not only have the power to take someone's freedom,
But their life.
under the circumstances, you have the power to take their life. So, as such, if we have people who can't see past their bias, then those are people who I can't see hiring on an department. And what we do once you're there, because we're human, you could come into the department a perfectly great specimen, but over time, things happen. You get divorced, you have other challenges. You've seen so much destruction and broken lives that it affects you. And then all of a sudden now your bias comes to the surface and you're no longer a peace officer. You're more or less an occupying force, right? You have to have supervision in place and you have to have mechanisms in place to catch that, to suppress it, reverse it, or eliminate it. And that's where top police leaders come in. It's not an easy job, but it's easier than dealing with the fallout of not dealing with, people that shouldn't be in the profession.
Yeah. Can you speak more to what that looks like, where you're talking about what are the systems that will help departments catch that and eliminate it?
So we have in our department, so we purchased this software. Now software can't do everything. You need human beings have to be engaged, but we purchased this software. It's called IA Pro, Internal Affairs Pro. So what happens is, let's say for instance, you have the most aggressive, you're a sergeant, you have the most aggressive squad, you have the second most aggressive squad, I have the least aggressive squad. They don't write tickets, they don't find, so my troops are just basically lazy, right? But your troops, they do a lot of great work, but they get complaints against them all the time. So, but one person is so good in your troop, he moves from 3rd shift to 2nd shift, so now he's with you, and then he gets promoted to detective, so now he's upstairs with me. Well, if you're not monitoring that person's track record over time, their track record can get lost. With this IA Pro software, it doesn't matter what you did 10 years ago or 5 years ago, it's all tracked, right? So if you have someone that has, maybe your squad is a little heavy-handed and they get more excessive force complaints than your squad. Like as a commander, I could see that, right? Even though nobody told me, the data tells me, right? But the data has to be in a place where it's collated and available, right? So this is just one thing that we introduced in 2015 that we think can help us be transparent, and we're still putting data into this, so it'll build over time. That's just one way. The other way, obviously frontline supervision. You just have to have leaders that are accountable and understand that, ultimately these people follow you, right? They may see the chief 2-3 times a month if they have, but they see their sergeant every day they come to work, right? So you have to have the right leaders in place, and you have to make sure that everybody is accountable. I'm accountable to the city at large, and so I have to make sure that those people that are accountable throughout the chain of command do their part, right? And that's what it's all about. It's gonna take all of us to do our part.
Chief, I've got a question on that. We talked a little about officer override and things like that previously, because we've seen in a lot of these situations where there's been some young officers with some veteran officers, and Kelly and I have talked about it. We've talked about it. I've talked with my chief about it.
Yeah.
How do we empower these younger officers to feel that they have a right to step in
Right.
and say something when they're seeing something wrong? Because we all know, we've all been doing this more than a day here. We know
Yeah.
if I'm an FTO and I have a young officer with me and I'm doing something, some kind of a tactic to somebody, as a DAT instructor too,
Right.
and I'm doing this tactic, how does this young officer, 2, 3, 4 days or 4 weeks or even a year out of the academy, how do they come and tell me to stop?
Understood.
When I may have been their DAT instructor in school.
Listen, phenomenal question. So I'm gonna watch your body language when I give you the first half of the question. To see if
Yeah.
it resonates. Then I'll give you that. So the first half of the question, officer override happens already, like, not every day, but let's say, for instance, you and I are in the same squad. I'm a hothead, and you know I'm a hothead. You get a call to go to XYZ, and you know those people. The first thing you're gonna do as a veteran officer is call me off. You're gonna say, you know what? I got this.
Or definitely get to that call
Yeah,
before
yeah.
you.
And that happens on a regular. Now, we may not wanna admit that happens, but that happens, right?
Oh, yeah.
We know that happens. Like, okay, I don't wanna, if this person comes to the call, it's probably gonna go sideways.
Yeah.
So I'll call you if I need you. So the override stuff already happens, right? But to get to your more specific question, which is a little harder, if I'm a brand new person,
It's a lot harder.
it's a lot harder, because now it's like I'm supposed to be learning from these folks.
Mhm.
But like I told the young people in the room when I did these interviews the last 2 days, I said, listen, the fact that we're bringing you here, we're not bringing you here to be a clone or a cookie cutter. There's a baseline of things that we expect, but then there's a uniqueness that you bring to this organization. And once we give you the basic tools, now we're gonna expect you to let your personality shine. So in other words, I'm not looking for conformists. I'm looking
Right.
for people who have, solid character, integrity. And so if you're gonna stand on that, then you have the authority to tell someone who's senior to you. I mean, you'll do it respectfully and you'll do
Yeah.
it diplomatically, but you have moral standing, which is more important than rank,
Right.
right?
Right. How are you addressing that with your supervision at the agency? Like, an officer says something to a senior officer, like, hey, that was wrong, whatever, and they come to the, your admin staff, they come to the sergeant, work their way up or whatever. How are you addressing, because we all know that it's gotta come from the top down.
Right. So what we say in our organization is that, and I tell folks this, I have an open door policy, so it's kind of a quasi-military organization. It's like,
Right.
we don't want you to bring disciplinary stuff, we don't want you to skip steps there.
Right.
But if you have conversations, questions, everybody in that building should have access to other people in the building, right? And it's just about, I can't influence anyone if they don't have access to my office, right? So I have to, so it's tricky, right? Because, I ran into a couple of unique situations where people would just, well, the chief is a little more open-minded, so I'll just go directly to the chief. Well, now you're circumventing, that's
Right,
different.
right.
So, you have to figure out, it's not 100% defined, but you have to make sure that these opportunities to teach and to mentor exist without the need to go everything through the chain. Because, if I'm a younger officer, I should have people I can go to talk to that are not my supervisor, right? Because it may be something personal that I don't want that person to know. So it's not easy, but I think depending upon the temperament of the people you have in the building, you can navigate through it. You just have to, it takes some time, But yeah, I agree with you, and I try to encourage the young people, listen, we brought you here for a reason, and it wasn't to clone you. It was, we saw something in you that we think will make this department better. You have to figure out when to use those components that you have. And so far, we're on the right track, but we're in this profession, and you know this, we're never done.
No.
It evolves.
Always
What
evolving.
was important 5 years ago, George Floyd, that situation changed policing for years to come. And so now, no matter what we've done in the community policing world, it's not good enough. Now
Nope.
we have to figure out how to be better. How can you be better? How can you train better? How can you hire better?
Yeah.
So constantly, that's the part of leadership. Like, I don't care. Okay, just give you a quick example. When I came on, burglary reduction was a big thing. We had over 1,000 burglaries every year. We reduced it to 900, 700, 600, 500. Last year, we had under 400, like all the way down to 325, right? So over 70+% reduction in burglaries over the last few years. I rarely make a big deal about that reduction. As impressive as it is statistically, like if you were one of the 325 people
It
that had
doesn't
your house
matter.
broken into, you could care less about
Right.
it. Just like at your house,
Right.
burglaries are up,
Right.
100%. So, I use that analogy just to say, no matter what we've done over the last 28 years in COP, and it's been some impressive things, right? It doesn't matter because we have to start over. Because people don't have a record of those 28 years, but because Twitter and social media and Facebook, they don't talk about all the good things that happened. For every George Floyd event, I mean, there's babies that were resuscitated, there's people that were run out of burning homes, there are all these different things that happen on those same days. But that doesn't hit the social media feed, right? And I'm not saying that it should necessarily, I'm just saying when we have these traumatic events, it changes perception about the profession. And so whether we like it or not, we have to respond to it, and you have to be better. You know,
Yeah.
figure out how can we be better.
And like you said, all the equity that you build up in the community, and I talk about this, and I know Kelly does too, when we're talking in a lot of classes and with community members, all that equity you build up in the community doing all these positive things, it takes one knuckleheaded thing done in a
1,000 miles away.
1,000 miles away, that has nothing to do with you or your department, that has just been totally burned through, and you're starting all over. How do we, as officers, help our communities understand that, yes, that happened, we think it's terrible too, but number one, we have to wait until, because we don't know what we don't know in those situations. You saw a 30-second clip.
Right.
We don't know what we don't know, but also, how do we get our communities to see us as individuals, individual departments,
Yeah.
but also as individuals?
Yeah.
And that our decisions, just because we wear similar uniforms, don't reflect on one another. How do we get our communities to see that? Because you guys do a lot of positive things in Racine, but something happens right next door.
Yeah, so this is gonna sound cliche, but I'm gonna tell you the answer.
Mhm.
It's pretty direct, straightforward, right?
That's
How
what I
you-
want.
Yeah, how you do it is like one call at a time, right? So that George Floyd happens, people in our community are upset, people across the nation are upset. So there's one of two things that are gonna happen. I show up on a call the next day, I'm gonna either affirm what people think about us, or I'm gonna give them a new perspective, right? So what I have to do is I have to understand on that call, like that's my first opportunity to make a difference, right? So to give people a different perspective. Now, here's the tough part. I'm probably gonna have to go to 100 calls just like that where people are gonna treat me the same. But I have to be big enough to know that it's really, they're not mad at me personally. They're upset with parts of the system. If I can get past that part, and if I can show them a different level of compassion, ultimately, we will break this down. But it's like, I sent out this major email, and I'm trying to explain to people, either we're gonna affirm what they think about us, or we're gonna basically break that stereotype down. The choice is yours. Like,
Yeah.
and it's what you do on that call that you go on tomorrow, next week. And it's very hard, right? Because we're frustrated, like, why do we get, if somebody else got an F on their paper, now I get an F.
Right.
When I studied hard enough to get an A.
Right.
Yeah, but that's, as I stated, this profession, you don't really choose it, it chooses you, right? And
It's
if
a
you're in it,
calling.
it's a calling. So either you're in or you're out. If you're in,
All
stay
the
in,
way.
and you're in all the way, and you're gonna have to help us dig out of this hole.
Yeah.
Otherwise, you're out.
Definitely. So we have 1 minute left. Is there anything else that anyone would like to state? Or-
Well, I'd like to know, Chief, we're doing this here at Parkside. Are you doing anything similar like this?
So a little different, so we built our own YouTube channel, and we have a video for one of our COP houses. You gotta see this video. It's the first time we did a documentary that really explains what COP is all about. I'll share the link so that you can share it with your
Fantastic,
listeners.
yeah.
And so this YouTube channel will help us get the other messages out about what our profession is all about.
Good, thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you all for tuning in and watching. We'll be here again next week, here on Facebook and Instagram. please remember to comment and ask questions.
And a special thanks to Chief for coming down, we
Yes,
really
thank you
appreciate
very
it.
much.
Thank you.
Thanks, Ryan.